This week we're talking about vacant property and the impact it has on communities, and it's something that nearly every community suffers from that's experienced a downturn in the economy. And mostly what happens is as we've moved to sprawl, as our local buildings and businesses have been replaced by out-of-town businesses, these spaces that were built by local families to house local businesses empty out, and they don't serve the role that they once used to. They don't serve the same purpose because they're obviously not housing those businesses. They're not economically productive, and so what you have is these sort of legacy buildings that sit here empty, deteriorating, and that becomes kind of the face of a community. It costs so much. It's incredibly expensive to allow property to go vacant. It depresses property values. It depresses residents. There's all these costs of letting property go vacant. And it really stifles a local economy. It really hinders a community, and it really affects how people feel about a town. I mean, this is apathy in its sort of purest form, and of course that's going to affect the people that live near this, to look at this every day, to see it, to have to watch it, to stare at it, and see what's happening in your community. It's absolutely going to affect how people feel about their community, and affect how they treat their community, and going to lead them to talk shit on their community. And it's just going to affect everybody, and it's sort of that fabric is deteriorating right before everybody's eyes, and how damaging that is. We need to get to the solutions, and really what it comes down to is it has to be the community coming together. It has to be the community imploring and mobilizing local government to work with local government to use legal tactics and enforcement of these different tools that are available. And there's a lot of legislation that's been passed in recent years at the state level to deal with properties like this. But your council's not going to do anything if you don't speak up. If you allow this to go, if the community doesn't speak up, if the citizens don't say, like, this is bullshit and it has to stop, the council's not going to do anything. They don't want the pushback. They don't want to deal with these angry property owners saying, oh, how dare you in property rights. So, all the tools are available, but it does come down to local people speaking up and saying, we're not going to stand for this. What are you going to do about it? Because I can tell you, until it's too expensive, until you hit these property owners in the pocketbook, they're not going to do anything. They're not going to be motivated to do anything. And that comes back to citizen action. People speaking up and saying, this is not going to stand in my community. Is that we stop decline before it gets to this point. That as soon as we see something, we step up. That we don't let buildings get to this condition, because at this point, it's too hard. And the problem becomes too large, and it's almost hard to negotiate. So we have to stop before it gets to this point. And it's funny how we get this when it comes to residential property. If this was the house next to you, you would say something. You'd call the city right away. They'd come out and they'd do something about it. They'd fix this, they'd address it. And so we should treat this more importantly than we do a house. I mean, this is critical. So we can't let these buildings get to the point where they're in this shape. And it's not a property rights issue. That shit gets thrown out there all the time. It's like, oh, no, it is not your right to let property decline to this point. Absolutely not. It's your right that if you have money invested in a property, that nearby properties don't damage your value. That it's property rights to protect the value in your investment. So, we get this property rights argument all wrong. So what do we do? Really it comes down to local government. We have to use the levers of government to try to take control of this problem. And there's often this misconception. It's like, oh, well, these property owners, they're just waiting for somebody to lease or somebody to buy, and that's not true. Usually these property owners are out of town. They've got multiple properties. They're using it as a tax write-off. Like, this place doesn't matter to them. And so it's up to local government to try to get control of these places. The property issue isn't just derelict buildings and abandonment and condemnation. It really is just, a small slip. It's when things start to decline just a little bit. It's too late once all the buildings are empty and condemned. It's a matter of getting on top of it early. It's when we have all the buildings are full and then one property owner stops maintaining. It's when something goes empty and they decide not to lease again. Like, that's where these problems spiral out of control. And that's where we have to be on top of it. And it's not an issue just with poor communities or blighted communities. Like, it's an issue in every community. Be vigilant and to make sure that properties don't have a chance to sit vacant. They don't have a chance to start to decline. And if we keep on top of it, we can make sure that we keep that standard up. It's not that we can't do anything. It's that if we're willing to do something, if we're willing to talk to local government and make this issue such a big deal, make it such a priority, that something occurs. But you can't just keep saying, oh, we can't do anything, it's private property. Like, that's not true. It's not the case that there's nothing to be done. There's absolutely the tools, and plenty of cities have done it. It's a decision of whether or not you're going to.